In a Pacific Heights mansion, an overlooked granddaughter was about to witness her family's shocking greed. What started as a will reading took a dramatic turn when they discovered a hidden heir worth $35 million. Sandy Curtis wasn't your typical social worker. For 3 years, she had dedicated her life to helping homeless populations, known for her compassion towards society's most vulnerable. When she encountered her lost half-brother David, she had no idea she was walking into a family war. Sandy's choice of moral courage over wealth would transform the entire Chen legacy into something meaningful. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sandy Curtis had been to her grandfather's Pacific Heights mansion exactly 3 times in her adult life. Each visit had left her feeling like a trespasser in someone else's world, and today promised no different. The Uber driver's eyes widened as they approached the imposing Victorian structure, its towers and gables rising against the San Francisco skyline like something out of another century. "This is it?" he asked, double-checking the address on his phone. Sandy nodded, though she understood his disbelief. The mansion sat behind wrought iron gates on one of the city's most exclusive streets, its manicured gardens and marble fountains speaking of wealth that spanned generations. Her own studio apartment in the Mission could have fit in the mansion's front foyer. She paid the driver and walked through gates that opened with electronic precision. The house loomed before her, all gleaming windows and restored stonework. Someone had spent serious money maintaining William Chen's legacy, though she doubted it was sentiment that motivated the upkeep. "Sandy, you actually came!" Victoria Chen Morrison's voice carried that particular tone Sandy remembered from childhood, surprise mixed with faint condescension. Her cousin stood in the mansion's entrance, elegant in the way that only came from a lifetime of expensive everything. At 32, Victoria had perfected the art of looking effortlessly sophisticated while making others feel underdressed. "Eleanor said it was important that all family members attend," Sandy replied, conscious of her off-the-rack blazer and discount store heels. She dressed as professionally as her social worker's salary allowed, but standing next to Victoria's designer suit, she felt like she was wearing a costume. "Of course she did. Eleanor has always been thorough about protocol." Victoria's smile held no warmth. "James is already inside. We were just discussing grandfather's interesting philanthropic choices in his final years." The way Victoria said interesting suggested she found nothing admirable about William Chen's late-life charity work. Sandy had read about some of it in the business pages: substantial donations to homeless shelters, addiction recovery programs, job training initiatives. As someone who worked daily with San Francisco's most vulnerable populations, Sandy had felt a surprising pride in her grandfather's efforts. "Those were good causes," Sandy said quietly. "Were they?" Victoria's eyebrow arched with practiced skepticism. "Throwing money at society's problems rarely solves anything, but then you'd know more about that than I would, given your career choices." Sandy let the comment slide. She'd learned long ago that defending her work to this family was pointless. They saw her job as a social worker as evidence of either noble foolishness or lack of ambition, depending on their mood. The mansion's interior hadn't changed since Sandy's last visit 5 years ago. Marble floors reflected light from crystal chandeliers, while oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors watched from gilt frames. Everything spoke of money that had been accumulating for generations, growing and compounding, while Sandy's own family struggled to make rent. James Chen Morrison emerged from the library, wineglass in hand, despite the early afternoon hour. Victoria's younger brother had always been the gentler of the 2 siblings, but gentleness in this family still came wrapped in privilege and casual dismissal of those deemed lesser. "Sandy," he nodded, his greeting carrying the distant politeness reserved for distant relatives. "I wasn't sure you'd make it. Don't you have to work today?" "I took time off," Sandy said, though the truth was she'd had to use a precious sick day for this gathering. Her supervisor at the Community Outreach Center hadn't been pleased with the short notice. "Right, well, Eleanor's setting up in grandfather's study. She says this shouldn't take long.
Mostly just formalities, maybe a few bequests to staff, maybe something for his charities, then the real business. Sandy understood what he meant by real business. The Chen family fortune, built over 3 decades of Silicon Valley success, would need to be distributed. She'd done the math in sleepless nights, not out of greed, but from grim curiosity. With an estimated $50 million estate, even the crumbs would be substantial.
The tenderloin? Of course. Victoria began pacing behind her chair, her legal mind already calculating angles of attack. Eleanor, you cannot seriously expect us to believe that grandfather left $35 million to a homeless drug addict. Victoria, no, this is insane, completely insane. Victoria's pacing grew more agitated. Even if this David person exists, even if he really is Marcus's son, there are competency issues, mental health concerns, legal challenges we can file immediately. Eleanor's voice carried a warning. Victoria, I need to advise you that William was very thorough in his planning. He anticipated potential challenges to David's inheritance. Did he anticipate a challenge from someone with a JD from Stanford and 15 years of estate law experience? Because that's exactly what he's getting. James was studying his hands, his artist's fingers trembling slightly. A brother, he said quietly. Marcus had a son, and we never knew? We never knew because no one told us. How long have you known about this? How long has grandfather been planning this theft? It's not theft when it's his money to give, Sandy said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. Victoria's attention snapped to her like a predator noticing prey. Oh, please, you can't seriously support this madness. Sandy, think about what you're saying. $35 million to someone who's probably never held a job, never contributed anything to society. Someone who's struggled with problems that aren't his fault. Sandy interrupted, her social worker instincts overriding her family intimidation. Someone who's been in recovery for 3 years, which is incredibly difficult to achieve. Recovery. Victoria's laugh was bitter. You know what the relapse rate is for people like that? And you want to hand him enough money to buy drugs for the entire city? Eleanor's voice cut through their argument. William was very aware of David's challenges. That's exactly why he structured the inheritance the way he did. She pulled out another document, this one sealed with William's personal stamp. David won't receive a lump sum. The inheritance is held in trust, with Eleanor Pearson Associates serving as trustees. David will receive a monthly stipend, sufficient for housing, healthcare, and basic needs, with additional funds available for education, job training, or approved investments. A trust? Victoria's pacing stopped. How much monthly? $50,000 per month, with annual reviews based on his continued sobriety and stability. James whistled low. $50,000 a month? That's $600,000 a year. More than most people make in a decade. But Sandy caught her slight relaxation in her posture. A trust was harder to challenge than an outright bequest. Their grandfather had been thorough. Sandy was doing her own calculations. $600,000 annually was more than she'd make in 20 years of social work. For someone transitioning out of homelessness, it was life-changing wealth managed responsibly. There's something else, Eleanor said, her voice growing more careful. William asked me to arrange a meeting. He wanted David to meet his family, to have the chance to connect with the relatives he's never known. Absolutely not. Victoria's response was immediate. I will not legitimize this farce by treating some tenderloin addict like family. He is family. He's a stranger with a genetic connection and a drug problem, Victoria shot back. Sandy, you work with these people. You know what they're like. Manipulative, unreliable, dangerous when they don't get what they want. The casual dismissal of her clients, of people Sandy worked with daily who were struggling with impossible circumstances, sparked something hot in her chest. I know they're human beings who deserve compassion and support, not judgment from people who have never faced real hardship. Real hardship?
Sandy, your entire life has been subsidized by this family. Your college tuition, your living expenses during grad school. Where do you think that money came from? The words hit like a slap. Sandy had always assumed those payments came from some small trust her father had left, not from the family that barely acknowledged her existence. That's enough, Eleanor said firmly. This is exactly why William structured things the way he did. He wanted to provide for all his grandchildren while protecting David from judgment. She pulled, standing, gathering the legal documents with movements that suggested the meeting was over, whether they were ready or not.
I'll be in touch with each of you about the specifics of your inheritances. Sandy, I have some additional materials your grandfather left specifically for you. Victoria, James, your bequests will be processed through standard probate procedures. Victoria wasn't finished. Eleanor, I'm telling you right now, I will contest this will. I'll challenge David's paternity, his competency, the validity of the trust structure, everything. Eleanor's smile was professional, but cold. That's your right, Victoria. But I should mention that William anticipated that possibility too. Any heir who challenges the will forfeits their inheritance entirely. The funds revert to David's trust. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Challenge the will and lose everything. Sandy looked around the room that had witnessed the destruction of everything she thought she knew about her family. Her grandfather, who she'd barely known, had left her more money than she could spend in a lifetime. Her cousins, who dismissed her for years, were now facing the possibility of losing their expected windfall to a brother none of them had known existed. And somewhere in San Francisco's Tenderloin district was a man named David Chen Williams, who had no idea his life was about to change forever.
The Tenderloin hit Sandy like a physical force the moment she stepped out of the BART station. The contrast with Pacific Heights was so stark. It felt like traveling between different planets rather than different neighborhoods. Here, the sidewalks told stories of struggle in ways her grandfather's manicured estate never could. Makeshift shelters tucked into doorways, the sharp scent of desperation and survival, mixing with exhaust fumes and something she couldn't quite identify. Sandy had worked with homeless populations for 3 years, but always from the safety of community centers and outreach offices. Walking these streets as someone searching for family rather than providing services felt entirely different. Every face she passed could belong to her brother, a thought that made her chest tight with possibility and fear. Eleanor had given her an address on Jones Street, a transitional housing facility called New Horizons that apparently specialized in long-term recovery support. The building looked like what it was, a former single-room occupancy hotel, converted into something more hopeful, but still undeniably institutional. Clean but worn, functional but not comfortable. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with gentle eyes and the weathered hands of someone who'd seen everything, looked up when Sandy approached the security window.
I'm looking for David Chen Williams, Sandy said, her voice carrying more nervousness than she'd intended. I'm his sister. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. Sister? David's never mentioned family. Half-sister, Sandy corrected quickly. We only just found out about each other. There was a will reading yesterday, and she trailed off, realizing how insane it must sound. Hi, I'm here to meet the brother I never knew existed because our dead grandfather left him $35 million. Let me call up to Dr. Kim, the receptionist said, reaching for the phone. She's David's counselor. She'll want to talk to you first. 10 minutes later, Sandy found herself in a small office that managed to feel warm despite its obvious budget constraints. Dr. Sarah Kim was younger than Sandy had expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of direct gaze that came from working with people who'd learned not to trust easily. Sandy Curtis, Dr. Kim said, settling behind her desk. I have to admit, this is unexpected. David's never mentioned having family.
He probably doesn't know I exist either. Sandy perched on the edge of her chair, suddenly conscious of how her professional clothes marked her as an outsider here. Our grandfather kept secrets, apparently. A lot of them. Dr. Kim studied her with the assessment skills Sandy recognized from her own work. You're a social worker? How did you... Sandy started, then laughed. Right, occupational hazard. We all develop the same way of sitting, don't we? Among other things. Dr. Kim's smile was cautious but warmer. What kind of social work? Community outreach, homeless services mainly. I work with people transitioning into housing, connecting them with resources. People like David, I guess. Something in Dr. Kim's expression shifted, becoming more alert. That's interesting. Your grandfather never mentioned your profession when he visited? Grandfather visited David? Every few months for the past 2 years. William Chen was very invested in David's recovery. Dr. Kim leaned forward slightly. Sandy, I need to ask, what exactly do you want from David? Because he's worked incredibly hard to get where he is, and I won't let anyone or anything threaten his stability.
The protective edge in Dr. Kim's voice reminded Sandy of her own advocacy for clients, and she felt an unexpected rush of gratitude that David had someone looking out for him. I don't want anything from him, Sandy said honestly. I just found out yesterday that I have a brother. I've been alone my whole life, thinking I was the only one left from my father's side of the family. Now I discover there's someone else, someone who's been struggling while I had no idea he existed. Dr. Kim was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing considerations Sandy couldn't guess at. David's recovery is solid, she said finally. 3 years clean, steady progress in our life skills programs, no major incidents. But he's also never had to deal with family dynamics. That can be complicated for people with his background. His background? Foster care, aging out of the system, years on the streets. People like David learn early that family usually means disappointment or abandonment. The idea of having relatives who actually want to connect? Dr. Kim shook her head. It's not something he's ever had to process.
Sandy thought about her own childhood, raised by a loving but financially struggling mother, while the wealthy side of her family remained distant and disapproving. She'd known rejection, but never abandonment, never the kind of institutional care that created its own trauma. There's something else, Dr. Kim continued, the inheritance. Eleanor Pierce contacted me about it yesterday. $50,000 a month is life-changing money for someone transitioning out of homelessness, but it's also terrifying. David's worked so hard to build a stable life on very little. Sudden wealth can be as destabilizing as sudden loss. That's why grandfather structured it as a trust, isn't it, to protect him? Partly, but also because William understood David in ways I think surprised both of them. Dr. Kim pulled out a file, then seemed to think better of sharing whatever was inside. Your grandfather saw something in David that reminded him of his own son, your Uncle Marcus. The intelligence, the artistic ability, the sensitivity that made Marcus vulnerable to addiction in the first place. Sandy felt a strange chill. David's an artist? Painter. Very talented, actually. The community center displays some of his work. Dr. Kim's expression grew more thoughtful. You know, there might be more connecting you and David than just genetics. Your choice to work with homeless populations, David's artistic talent, your grandfather's late-life philanthropy, it's like William was trying to bridge the gap between the family that abandoned David and the person David became despite that abandonment.
have known this was David. He had Marcus's build, the same dark eyes she remembered from old family photos, and something indefinable that reminded her of herself. Sarah, sorry to interrupt. I was looking for. David stopped mid-sentence when he saw Sandy, his expression shifting from casual to cautious in an instant. David, Dr. Kim said gently, this is Sandy Curtis. She's your half-sister. David's hand remained on the doorframe, his knuckles white with tension. Sandy could see him processing the information, see the years of learned wariness warring with something that might have been hope. Half-sister, he repeated, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily. Our fathers were brothers, Sandy said, standing slowly so she wouldn't seem threatening. Thomas and Marcus. I only found out about you yesterday, at our grandfather's will reading. David's eyes flicked to Dr. Kim, who nodded encouragingly. The will reading, where William left you $35 million, he said, and Sandy caught the slate edge in his voice. Sarah told me, hell of a thing to find out you have family and money on the same day. I got some money too, Sandy said quickly. $10 million. I'm still trying to process it.
David laughed, but there was no humor in it. 10 million in processing difficulties? I can't even imagine. They stood there in Dr. Kim's small office, two strangers connected by blood and circumstance, neither knowing how to bridge the gap between their vastly different worlds. Sandy saw intelligence in David's eyes, but also the kind of careful assessment she recognized from her most traumatized clients. He was measuring her, trying to determine if she represented safety or threat. Would you like to sit down? Sandy asked. Maybe we could talk. I'd like to know about you, about our family. David looked at Dr. Kim again, seeking guidance or permission. Sandy realized that after years of institutional living, he'd learned to check with authority figures before making personal decisions. It's up to you, David, Dr. Kim said softly. But Sandy seems genuine, and you've been curious about family connections. David stepped fully into the office, closing the door behind him. Okay, he said, settling into the chair across from Sandy. Let's talk about family. Though I should warn you, my experience with the concept hasn't been particularly positive.
David settled into the chair across from Sandy with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to take up minimal space. His hands, she noticed, were stained with paint around the fingernails, evidence of the artistic work Dr. Kim had mentioned. Something about those stains made him seem more real, more human than the abstract concept of lost brother she'd been carrying since yesterday. So, David said, his voice carrying that same careful neutrality. $10 million. That's gotta feel surreal. Sandy nodded, grateful he'd started with something concrete. Completely. 24 hours ago, I was worried about making rent next month. Now I'm trying to process having more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Rent worries. Yeah, I remember those. David's smile held genuine warmth for the first time, though mine were usually more about finding rent money than making it on time. The casual reference to homelessness might have been awkward with someone else, but Sandy's professional experience helped her navigate it naturally. How long were you on the streets?
On and off for about 8 years. Foster care until 18, then aging out with no resources and a lot of unresolved trauma. Not exactly a recipe for success. David's tone remained matter-of-fact, but Sandy caught the slate tension around his eyes. Started using when I was 19. Heroin mostly. Seemed like a reasonable response to everything at the time. Dr. Kim watched this exchange carefully, Sandy noticed, ready to intervene if the conversation became too much. But David seemed steady, like someone who'd processed his story enough times to tell it without falling apart. What changed? Sandy asked, 3 years ago. I mean, what made you get clean? David was quiet for a moment, his paint-stained fingers drumming against the chair arm. Grandfather found me. Sandy blinked.
Grandfather found you? William Chen, looking for Marcus's son in the most obvious place, the streets where addicts go to die. David's voice carried a mixture of affection and still fresh amazement. I was sleeping in Golden Gate Park, probably days away from overdosing, when this old Chinese man in an expensive coat started talking to me about my father.
As he remembered, he sat down on the bench next to me, this 80-year-old millionaire tech founder sitting next to a junkie in the park, and started telling me stories about Marcus. Sandy felt her chest tighten. What kind of stories? How Marcus used to paint these incredible landscapes when he was clean. How he'd help other addicts get into treatment programs, even when he couldn't stay clean himself. How William regretted not doing more to save him. David's expression grew softer. He said Marcus talked about me constantly, worried about what would happen to me if he died. William felt like he'd failed his son, and he wasn't going to fail his grandson too. The picture David painted challenged everything Sandy thought she knew about their grandfather. The distant, successful businessman who'd barely acknowledged her existence had spent years searching for a homeless grandson, then invested time and resources in helping him recover. He just helped you get clean? Not just helped, participated. David's smile became more genuine. William visited me in detox, sat through my early recovery meetings, learned about addiction like he was studying for a business presentation, which, knowing him, he probably was. Dr. Kim nodded. William was incredibly committed to understanding David's recovery process. He read everything, asked detailed questions, wanted to know exactly how to be supportive without being enabling. That sounds like him, Sandy said, remembering her grandfather's methodical approach to everything. When he decided to do something, he researched it thoroughly. He researched me too, David said, and for the first time, his voice carried a hint of vulnerability. Wanted to know about my childhood, my time in foster care, what led to the addiction. Not in a judgmental way, more like he was trying to understand how the system had failed, what could have been different. Sandy thought about her own childhood, raised by a loving but struggling mother, while the Chen family remained distant. Did he ever talk about the rest of the family? David's expression grew more guarded. Some. He mentioned you occasionally, said you worked with homeless populations, that you understood people like me better than the rest of the family would. He paused. He also said you'd been excluded from family gatherings, that they treated you like you didn't belong. They did. They do. My father died when I was 5, and my mother wasn't wealthy enough to fit into their world. I grew up knowing I had this successful family who wanted nothing to do with me.
At least you had a mother who loved you, David said quietly. Mine had a complete breakdown after Marcus died. Couldn't handle being a single parent to a traumatized 12-year-old. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the different forms of abandonment they'd experienced. Sandy had been excluded but safe. David had been truly alone in ways she was only beginning to understand. William talked about bringing us together, David continued. Said the family had lost too much already, that maybe it was time to heal some of the damage. His laugh held no humor. I don't think he expected it to happen quite like this, though. With you inheriting $35 million and the rest of the family in an uproar? With me having enough money to either build a new life or destroy myself completely. William understood that wealth could be as dangerous as poverty for someone with my history. David looked directly at Sandy for the first time. That's why the trust structure, the monthly payments instead of a lump sum. He was protecting me from myself as much as from everyone else. Sandy saw the intelligence in David's eyes, the self-awareness that came from years of recovery work and therapy. This wasn't the damaged addict Victoria had imagined, but someone who understood his own vulnerabilities and had built strategies to manage them.
"What are you going to do?" she asked.
With the money, with knowing you have family now. David's smile was cautious, but held real warmth. I was hoping we could figure that out together. The emergency family meeting took place in Victoria's Nob Hill penthouse, a space designed to intimidate through its casual display of wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the San Francisco Bay, while museum-quality art and furniture spoke of money that had been accumulating for generations. Sandy felt like she was entering enemy territory as Victoria's housekeeper led her through the marble foyer. "Sandy, finally," Victoria said, rising from her position behind a glass desk that probably cost more than Sandy's annual salary. "We need to discuss the situation before it gets completely out of hand." James sat in one of the leather chairs arranged in a conversation area that looked more like a corporate boardroom than anyone's living room. He held a tumbler of what appeared to be whiskey, though it was barely past noon. His eyes had the slightly unfocused quality that suggested this wasn't his first drink of the day. "I brought Eleanor," Victoria continued, gesturing to the family attorney who sat rigidly on the sofa. "We need professional guidance on our legal options." Eleanor's expression suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with this gathering. Her usual professional composure seemed strained, like someone being asked to participate in something that conflicted with her principles. "Victoria," Eleanor said carefully, "I should remind you that I represented William's interests, not necessarily the family's. My primary obligation is to honor his wishes. Your obligation is to ensure the will is legally sound and properly executed, which means addressing obvious competency issues and potential fraud."
The photos showed David at his worst. Hollow-eyed, thin to the point of illness, clearly deep in the grip of addiction. Sandy recognized the progression she'd seen in countless clients, the physical deterioration that came with years of street living and drug use. "These are from his addiction period," Sandy said. "People in recovery don't look like this anymore." "Recovery!" Victoria's laugh held no warmth. "Do you know what the long-term success rate is for heroin addiction recovery? Less than 20%. We're talking about giving $35 million to someone who, statistically, will relapse within 5 years. James was studying the photos with something that looked like recognition rather than disgust. "He looks like Marcus," he said quietly, "in the bad periods. When Uncle Marcus was using, he had that same..." He gestured vaguely at the images. "Exactly my point," Victoria said, seizing on James's observation. "Marcus couldn't handle his own life, couldn't stay clean, died of an overdose, and left his son to become a ward of the state. Why would we trust his son with the family fortune?" "Because people aren't their parents," Sandy said, surprised by the force in her own voice. "Because David has been clean for 3 years, has built a stable life, and deserves the chance to prove himself." "Stable life?" Victoria pulled out another document. "Sandy, his current address is transitional housing in the Tenderloin. His income is government disability payments. He has no job, no education beyond high school, no skills that would translate to managing wealth responsibly." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. "Victoria, I should point out that William was very aware of David's circumstances when he structured the inheritance. The trust arrangement specifically addresses concerns about financial management and addiction relapse." "The trust arrangement that you oversee," Victoria said pointedly, "which gives you tremendous power over $35 million. Some might say that creates its own conflict of interest." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing genuine offense beneath her careful neutrality. "Are you questioning my professional integrity?" Eleanor asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I'm questioning whether anyone in this situation is thinking clearly, and grandfather included. An 82-year-old man reconnecting with a previously unknown grandson who happens to be a homeless addict, the potential for manipulation is enormous." Sandy stood abruptly, unable to sit still under the weight of Victoria's calculated assault on David's character. "You're talking about him like he's not human. Like addiction and homelessness make him fundamentally less worthy of family connection or support?
I'm talking about him like someone whose lifestyle choices have demonstrated a pattern of poor judgment and instability. Victoria shot back. Would you give $35 million to any of your clients, Sandy? Really? Would you hand that kind of money to someone fresh out of the streets and expect them to handle it responsibly?
The trust structure addresses those concerns, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The trust structure provides $50,000 a month to someone whose previous monthly income was maybe $1,500 in disability payments, Victoria countered. That's not gradual transition, that's setting him up for failure. James finished his whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate care. What exactly are you proposing, Victoria? Victoria's smile was all sharp edges and legal calculation. We contest the will. We argue that grandfather lacked testamentary capacity due to age and grief, that David exercised undue influence over a vulnerable elderly man, and that the inheritance structure is fundamentally flawed. We petition for a more reasonable distribution that acknowledges David's relationship to the family while protecting the estate from his obvious unfitness to manage it. And if we lose? Sandy asked. We won't lose. I've been researching precedent cases all night. With David's history and the suspicious circumstances of his relationship with grandfather, any reasonable judge will see the problems with this will. Victoria's confidence was absolute, built on years of successful legal practice and the assumption that money and status would prevail. Eleanor stood, gathering her papers, with movements that suggested she'd heard enough. I should remind you all that any challenge to William's will must be filed within 120 days of probate. You have time to consider your options carefully. She paused at the door, looking back at Sandy with something that might have been disappointment. Sandy, I hope you'll think seriously about what William would have wanted. He believed in second chances and the power of family love to heal old wounds. But he also believed in protecting the people he cared about from those who would harm them. After Eleanor left, Victoria turned to Sandy with the predatory focus of someone closing in on victory. So what's it going to be, Sandy? Are you going to stand with your actual family, or are you going to support a stranger whose addiction issues make him a danger to everything grandfather built? Sandy looked around Victoria's perfectly appointed penthouse, at James nursing his own addiction in a crystal tumbler, at Victoria, whose sense of entitlement had led her to question a principled attorney's integrity. Then she thought about David, paint-stained fingers and careful movements, 3 years of sobriety and the humility that came from rebuilding a life from nothing. David isn't a stranger. He's our brother. Victoria's expression went cold. Half-brother. And if you support him over your actual family, you'll find out just how alone that choice will leave you. Detective Ray Santos had seen enough of San Francisco's underbelly to recognize when someone was being hunted. The call to Sandy came 3 days after her confrontation with Victoria, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of 20 years working the city's most challenging cases. Miss Curtis, this is Detective Santos, SFPD. I need to talk to you about your brother, David Chen Williams. Someone's been asking questions about him, and not the friendly kind. Sandy met Santos at a coffee shop in the Castro, far enough from both Pacific Heights and the Tenderloin to feel neutral territory. The detective was a compact man in his early 40s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years working with society's most vulnerable populations. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp with the kind of assessment skills that came from constant vigilance. I've known David for about 5 years, Santos said, settling into the booth across from Sandy. First met him during a sweep of Golden Gate Park, back when he was sleeping rough. Different from most of the homeless folks I encounter. Too smart for his situation, if you know what I mean. Sandy nodded. Dr. Kim mentioned you'd worked with him. Worked with, looked out for, occasionally pulled him out of situations that could have gone very bad. Santos stirred his coffee with deliberate movements. David's got this way of helping other people on the streets, sharing resources, mediating disputes.
made him valuable to the community, but also made him visible to predators. What kind of predators? People who exploit the homeless, drug dealers, human traffickers, anyone looking for vulnerable marks. Santos's expression darkened. But that's not why I called you. Someone's been nosing around David's past, offering money for information about his addiction history, his time in foster care, any criminal activity they can dig up. Sandy felt her stomach tighten. Victoria. Your cousin hire a private investigator?
Probably. She's planning to contest our grandfather's will, and she wants ammunition to prove David's unfit to inherit. Sandy paused. Is that legal? Hiring a PI? Sure, if they're not breaking laws to get information. But some of the questions being asked, Santos shook his head, they're fishing for stuff that could be used to threaten David's sobriety, his housing situation, his support network. That crosses into harassment territory. Santos pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages covered with careful handwriting. Your cousin's investigator has been to David's old dealers, his former caseworkers, even tracked down some of his foster families, paying cash for stories about his worst moments. The image of David's private struggles being commodified for Victoria's legal strategy made Sandy feel physically sick. Can you stop them? Not easily, but I wanted you to know because David doesn't. Guy's been clean for 3 years, built a stable life, and now someone's digging through his worst moments looking for ways to hurt him. Santos closed his notebook. Thought his family should know what he's up against. Sandy realized Santos didn't know about the inheritance, about the $35 million that had turned David from invisible homeless men to threat worthy of professional investigation. The detective's protection came from simple human decency, not financial interest. Detective Santos, there's something you should know about the will. Already heard. William Chen left David a fortune. News travels fast in recovery circles, especially news that big. How's David handling it? Better than I expected, honestly. Kid's got perspective on money that aired. Not of the money itself, but of what it represents. Suddenly having family, having resources, having people pay attention to him, it's the kind of change that can trigger relapse, even in someone with solid recovery. Before Sandy could respond, her phone buzzed with a call from Eleanor Pierce. The attorney's voice was tense when Sandy answered. Sandy, I need to see you immediately. Something's happened with William's papers that you need to know about. An hour later, Sandy sat in Eleanor's downtown office surrounded by boxes of documents that told the story of William Chen's final years. Eleanor looked older than she had just days ago, the stress of family conflict and professional challenge taking its toll.
I've been going through William's private papers, Eleanor began, trying to find anything that might help us understand his final intentions. What I found, she paused, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Eleanor, what is it? The attorney opened a file marked Personal, Confidential, and withdrew a thick stack of letters written in William's careful handwriting. Letters to David, dating back 3 years. William documented everything, every visit, every conversation, every step of David's recovery process. Sandy picked up one of the letters, reading her grandfather's precise script. David showed me his paintings today. His talent reminds me so much of Marcus at his best, before the addiction took that away from him. I see in David what Marcus could have become, what our family lost when we failed to save him. He blamed himself for Marcus's death, felt that his focus on business success had made him miss the signs of his son's struggles. David became his chance at redemption. Another letter, dated 6 months ago. Victoria and James continue to disappoint me. Their sense of entitlement grows stronger while their compassion grows weaker. They see wealth as something they deserve, rather than something they should use responsibly. David understands that money is a tool, not a measure of worth. Sandy looked up at Eleanor. He was planning this for a long time. 2 years at least. But there's more. Eleanor withdrew another set of documents. William hired his own investigators to research the family's treatment of both you and David. He documented the exclusion, the dismissiveness, the way wealth had corrupted his other grandchildren's values. The investigation files were thorough and damning.
Photos of Victoria's extravagant lifestyle, James's mounting debts from his drinking and art purchases, documented instances of their casual cruelty towards service staff and anyone they considered beneath their social class. "But this is what really matters," Eleanor said, handing Sandy an envelope marked, "For Sandy, when she chooses." Inside was a letter written in William's familiar hand. "My dear Sandy, if you're reading this, then you've chosen to support David despite family pressure to abandon him. Your father Thomas would be proud of your moral courage. I always regretted not reaching out to you after his death, not fighting harder to keep you connected to the family. I let Linda's resentment and Elizabeth's prejudice drive away the granddaughter who most embodied the values I hope to instill." The letter continued, "David needs family who will love him without conditions, who will see his potential rather than his past. You understand struggle in ways Victoria and James never will. Together, you and David can use this inheritance to honor what the Chen family should represent: compassion, second chances, and the responsibility that comes with privilege." Eleanor was watching Sandy carefully. "There's one more thing." William included provisions for what would happen if the family turned against David. Additional funds held in a separate trust, accessible only if he faces legal challenges to his inheritance. "How much?" "Another $15 million, enough to fight any will contest and still provide for David's future." Eleanor's expression was grim. William anticipated exactly what's happening now. He knew Victoria would challenge the will, knew the family would try to destroy David rather than accept him. Sandy thought about Detective Santos's warning, about investigators digging through David's worst moments, about Victoria's systematic campaign to prove him unfit. Her grandfather had seen it all coming. "Eleanor, I need you to do something. I want you to set up a meeting with David and Dr. Kim. It's time he knew exactly what he's up against." Eleanor nodded. "And the additional trust funds?" Sandy looked at the letters spread across Eleanor's desk. Evidence of William's love for a grandson the family had written off, his disappointment in grandchildren who had everything but compassion, his faith that Sandy would choose moral courage over family approval. "Keep them secret for now, but prepare to activate them. Something tells me we're going to need every advantage we can get." Outside Eleanor's office windows, San Francisco's fog was rolling in from the bay, obscuring the city's landmarks in gray uncertainty. Sandy realized that her choice to support David had started something that couldn't be stopped, a family war that would determine not just who inherited William Chen's fortune, but what kind of legacy his family would leave behind.
The ambush came disguised as a family dinner invitation. Victoria's text arrived on a Thursday afternoon. "Family meeting tonight, 7 p.m., the mansion. Important decisions need to be made before this situation gets worse." Sandy almost declined, but something in the phrasing made her reconsider. This wasn't a request, it was a summons, and Victoria's choice to hold the meeting at their grandfather's house rather than her own penthouse suggested a calculated attempt to use the setting for maximum psychological impact. The mansion felt different in the evening light, shadows pooling in corners where William's presence had once provided warmth. Sandy arrived to find Victoria and James already positioned in the main living room, along with two people she didn't recognize: a sharp-featured woman in an expensive suit and a younger man with the predatory alertness of someone accustomed to digging through other people's secrets. "Sandy, good," Victoria said without preamble. "I'd like you to meet Catherine Walsh, our family's new legal counsel, and Michael Torres, a private investigator we've retained." Sandy remained standing, recognizing the power play in being the only one without a seat. New legal counsel? What happened to Eleanor? Eleanor has conflicts of interest that make her unsuitable for representing the family's true interests, Catherine Walsh replied smoothly. She's too emotionally invested in honoring William's wishes rather than protecting his legacy from obvious exploitation. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, a tumbler of whiskey already half empty despite the early hour. "Victoria, maybe we should..." "Should what, James? Let a homeless drug addict walk away with $35 million while we stand by and do nothing?" Victoria's voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose patience had reached its limit.
Michael Torres opened a thick file, spreading photographs and documents across the coffee table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Miss Curtis, I think you should see what we've discovered about your half-brother." The photos were devastating. David at his absolute worst, captured during his deepest addiction period. But worse than the images were the witness statements Torres had collected. Former dealers describing David's desperation for drugs, caseworkers documenting his failures in various programs, foster families recounting his behavioral problems as a traumatized teenager. "This is who you're defending," Victoria said, her voice carrying calculated cruelty. "Someone who stole from the people trying to help him, who manipulated social workers and counselors, who left a trail of broken promises and destroyed trust wherever he went."
Sandy studied the documents, recognizing the cherry-picked worst moments from what must have been years of struggle. These are from his addiction period. People in active addiction do desperate things. Exactly, Catherine Walsh interrupted, which raises serious questions about his current stability and fitness to manage significant wealth. We have documentation showing multiple relapses, failed treatment attempts, and a pattern of manipulative behavior toward authority figures. Torres leaned forward, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone who'd built a career destroying people's reputations. "We also have evidence that David specifically sought out your grandfather, that their first meeting wasn't the chance encounter he claimed." He produced surveillance photos showing David near William's office building, outside his favorite restaurant, in locations where a homeless man would have no legitimate reason to be. "He stalked grandfather," Victoria said, satisfaction evident in her voice, "researched his routines, positioned himself to appear randomly in William's path. The whole thing was a calculated con from the beginning." Sandy felt the ground shifting beneath her, doubt creeping in despite her growing bond with David. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. What were the odds that a homeless addict would randomly encounter his wealthy grandfather in a city of nearly 1 million people? "Even if that's true," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction, "it doesn't change the fact that David has been clean for 3 years. "Has he?" Torres smiled with predatory satisfaction, "because we have witness statements suggesting otherwise. Recent drug purchases, suspicious behavior around known dealers, the kind of activities that someone with his history would recognize." The accusation hit Sandy like a physical blow. Dr. Kim had sworn David's recovery was solid, his sobriety genuine. But Torres spoke with the confidence of someone who had proof. James stood uprightly, swaying slightly. "Stop! Just stop!" His voice was slurred but carried unexpected force. "You want to know about addiction? About relapse? About the kind of manipulation you're describing?" He gestured wildly with his glass, whiskey sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "Look at me. Look at what I am. Every morning I tell myself I'll stop drinking, and every afternoon I'm right back here, hiding in grandfather's house, medicating the disappointment of being exactly what everyone expects me to be." Victoria's expression turned cold. "James, you're drunk."
I'm always drunk, but at least I'm honest about it. James focused on Sandy with effort. "You know what the difference is between me and David? I never had to sleep on the streets. I never had to steal food or trade dignity for survival. I've had every advantage, every opportunity, and I'm still a fucking disaster." The raw honesty in James's confession created an uncomfortable silence. Sandy saw him clearly for the first time, not the privileged artist, but someone drowning in his own inadequacy while surrounded by wealth that couldn't buy self-respect. If David conned grandfather, then maybe grandfather deserved to be conned. Maybe he finally met someone who needed his help more than his money, someone who understood what it meant to fight for something instead of just expecting it. Victoria's composure cracked completely. "So you're taking their side? Against your own family?"
I'm taking the side of someone who earned his place in this family through struggle instead of inheriting it through accident of birth. David may have addiction issues, but at least he's fighting them. I just hide behind mine. The room erupted as Victoria realized she was losing control of the narrative she'd carefully constructed. Catherine Walsh attempted to redirect the conversation to legal strategies, while Torres gathered his photographs like evidence that had suddenly become irrelevant. But Sandy wasn't listening to the professional arguments anymore. She was watching James, seeing the moment when someone raised in privilege finally recognized the courage it took to survive without it. His support meant David wasn't alone in this, wasn't the only one being judged by people who'd never faced real consequences for their choices. "Victoria," Sandy said quietly, cutting through the chaos, "you can contest the will if you want. You can hire investigators and lawyers and try to destroy David's character, but you can't change the fact that grandfather saw something in him worth saving." Victoria's smile was arctic. "We'll see about that. Catherine, file the challenge tomorrow. And Sandy," her voice carried the finality of a door slamming shut, "when this is over, when David relapses or disappears or proves exactly what he is, don't expect this family to welcome you back." Sandy looked around the room that had witnessed her grandfather's final years, his secret planning, his hope that love could triumph over prejudice. "I wouldn't want to come back to a family that judges people's worth by their worst moments instead of their potential for growth." As she walked out of William Chen's mansion for what she suspected might be the last time, Sandy realized the family war wasn't just about money anymore. It was about two fundamental
Different visions of what family meant: conditional love based on success and status, or unconditional support that saw past mistakes to recognize human dignity. The battle lines were drawn, and there would be no neutral ground left when it was over. The intervention came together in Dr. Kim's office like a crisis response team assembling after a disaster. Sandy arrived to find David sitting rigidly in his usual chair, his face pale with the kind of stress that could trigger relapse in someone with his history. Eleanor Pierce sat across from him, legal documents spread between them like battle plans. "They're saying you stalked grandfather," Sandy said without preamble, taking the seat beside David. "Torres claims he has surveillance photos showing you following William around the city before your first meeting." David's laugh held no humor. "I did follow him. For about 3 days, trying to work up the courage to approach him." His hands were steadied despite the circumstances, Sandy noticed. 3 years of recovery had given him tools for managing stress that his cousins, despite their advantages, clearly lacked. "You were scared," Dr. Kim observed, her voice carrying the professional calm that helped keep David grounded. "Terrified," David admitted. "Here's this wealthy, successful man who lost his son to the same addiction that was killing me. What was I supposed to say? Hi, I'm the grandson you didn't know existed, and I'm exactly the kind of person who destroyed your family." Eleanor looked up from her legal documents. "David, the fact that you researched William's routines doesn't invalidate your relationship or his decision to help you. It shows you understood the magnitude of what you were asking for." "Victoria's lawyers won't see it that way," Sandy said. "They're spinning it as evidence of calculated manipulation, proof that everything about your recovery is fake." Before David could respond, James appeared in the doorway, looking more sober than Sandy had seen him in years. His eyes were clear, his movements steady, and he carried himself with the determination of someone who'd made a difficult decision. "Sorry I'm late," he said, settling into the remaining chair. "I had to fire my trust fund manager and close several accounts. Victoria's threatening to cut off my financial support if I don't recant my support for David." Sandy stared at her cousin. "You chose David over your inheritance?" "I chose doing the right thing over keeping quiet about doing the wrong thing," James corrected. "Victoria's been controlling my finances for years, using my drinking as justification. Maybe it's time I learned to manage my own life." Dr. Kim was studying James with professional interest. "That's a significant decision. Are you getting support for your alcohol dependency?" "Started AA yesterday," James said simply.
Figured if I'm going to support someone else's recovery, I should probably work on my own. The honesty in the room was startling. 4 people from vastly different backgrounds, united by their commitment to protecting David's inheritance and dignity from Victoria's systematic assault. Eleanor pulled out a new set of documents. There's something else you need to know. Victoria filed the will contest this morning, but she's also petitioned for an emergency restraining order to freeze David's trust distributions pending the outcome. Can she do that? Sandy asked. She can try. The argument is that David represents a flight risk, that sudden access to wealth could trigger dangerous behavior. Eleanor's expression was grim. Her new legal team is very aggressive, very experienced with high-stakes probate litigation. David had gone very still, the kind of stillness Sandy recognized from her clients when they were processing potentially devastating news. How long could a freeze last? Months? Possibly years if the case becomes complex. Eleanor's voice carried genuine regret. David, I'm sorry. William never anticipated this level of coordinated attack. Actually, he did, Sandy said, remembering the secret conversation in Eleanor's office. Tell them about the additional trust. Eleanor hesitated, clearly weighing professional discretion against practical necessity. William established a separate $15 million trust specifically to fund David's legal defense and living expenses if the family contested his inheritance. James whistled low. Grandfather really did think of everything. Not everything, Detective Stantos said from the doorway, his sudden appearance making everyone turn. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a problem. Someone tried to plant drugs in David's room at New Horizons last night. The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went white. The implications hitting him immediately. Planted drugs would destroy his housing situation, his recovery record, and any credibility he had in the legal proceedings. Victoria, Sandy breathed.
Can't prove it was her directly, but the timing's awfully convenient, Santos replied. Day after she files the will contest, someone tries to frame David for drug possession? That's not coincidence. Dr. Kim was watching David carefully, monitoring for signs of emotional breakdown. How are you processing this, David? I'm angry, David said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. But not at myself, not at my recovery. I'm angry that people think they can destroy me just because I'm inconvenient to their plans. The strength in his voice surprised Sandy. She'd expected fear, maybe panic, but David sounded more determined than defeated. We need to move fast, Eleanor said, switching into crisis management mood. First priority is securing David's safety and housing. Dr. Kim, can New Horizons provide additional security? Already arranged, Dr. Kim replied. And I've documented everything for David's file, his emotional state, his continued commitment to recovery, and the external stressors he's facing. Santos pulled out his notebook. I'll coordinate with New Horizons security, maybe have some unofficial patrol presence in the area. Victoria's escalating, which means she's getting desperate. James stood abruptly. I'm moving in with David. Everyone stared at him. What? Sandy asked. Victoria wants to isolate him, make him seem like a threat. But if he's got family support, if someone from the legitimate side of the family is vouching for him, James shrugged. Besides, I could use the accountability. Recovery works better with witnesses. David looked at his half-cousin with something approaching wonder. You do that? Live in transitional housing to support someone you barely know? You're not someone I barely know, James said firmly. You're my brother. And unlike the rest of this family, you've actually earned the right to be proud of who you're becoming. Sandy felt something shift in the room, a sense of purpose that went beyond protecting David's inheritance. They weren't just fighting Victoria's legal challenge anymore. They were proving that family could be chosen, that love could be unconditional, that people deserved support not because of what they had, but because of who they chose to become. All right, Eleanor said, gathering her documents with renewed energy. Victoria wants a war? Let's give her one she'll never forget. Outside Dr. Kim's office windows, San Francisco's afternoon fog was beginning to clear, revealing the city's complexity.
Wealthy neighborhoods and struggling communities, success stories and cautionary tales, all existing side by side in the complicated dance of urban life. Sandy realized their fight was about more than money now. It was about proving that redemption was possible, that family meant more than DNA or shared privilege, and that sometimes the people society wrote off were exactly the ones most worthy of love and support. The San Francisco Superior Court probate hearing drew spectators like a scandal magnet. Journalists hungry for stories about wealthy families destroying themselves, legal professionals curious about the complex inheritance dispute, and social workers who recognized David's case as representing something larger than individual justice. Sandy sat in the front row behind Eleanor's table, watching David maintain his composure as Victoria's legal team arranged their attack materials with military precision. Catherine Walsh had brought 3 associate attorneys and enough documentation to build a wall of alleged evidence against David's character and competency. Judge Patricia Morrison presided with the weathered authority of someone who'd spent 20 years adjudicating family disputes among San Francisco's elite. Her expression suggested she'd seen every variation of wealth-driven family destruction and wasn't impressed by displays of legal theatrics. "Your Honor," Catherine Walsh began, her voice carrying the polished confidence of someone accustomed to winning through intimidation. "This case represents a clear example of an elderly man being systematically manipulated by a troubled individual who exploited his grief and guilt to obtain a massive inheritance." She gestured toward a presentation screen where David's mugshot photos appeared in stark black and white. David Chen Williams has a documented history of drug addiction, criminal behavior, and manipulative relationships with authority figures. The evidence will show that he specifically targeted William Chen, researched his routines, and engineered their supposed chance encounter. Sandy watched David's face as his worst moments were displayed for public consumption. He remained steady, but she caught the slight tension around his eyes, the careful breathing that Dr. Kim had taught him for managing stress without triggering relapse responses. Furthermore, Walsh continued, recent evidence suggests that Mr. Chen Williams has been misrepresenting his sobriety status. We have witness testimony indicating continued drug activity that calls into question his fitness to manage any inheritance, much less $35 million. Eleanor rose with the calm authority of someone who'd spent decades protecting clients from legal predators. "Your Honor, with respect to opposing counsel, the evidence she's presenting
tells only part of David Chen Williams' story, specifically the part that serves her client's financial interests. She activated her own presentation, showing photographs of David's recovery journey, clean, healthy, engaged in community service and artistic work. What Miss Walsh's selective presentation ignores is 3 years of documented sobriety, stable housing, meaningful relationships, and the kind of personal growth that convinced William Chen to invest in his grandson's future. Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Miss Pierce, can you address the allegations about your client's misrepresentation of his recovery status?" "I can, Your Honor." Eleanor called her first witness, Dr. Sarah Kim. Dr. Kim took the stand with professional poise, her credentials as an addiction specialist giving weight to her testimony. Under Eleanor's careful questioning, she outlined David's recovery journey in detail: the detox program, the ongoing counseling, the community service work, the artistic pursuits that had replaced destructive behaviors. "In your professional opinion, Dr. Kim, is David Chen Williams currently sober?" "Absolutely. I've worked with him for 3 years, conducting regular drug screenings, monitoring his emotional stability, and documenting his consistent progress. His recovery is genuine and substantial." Catherine Walsh's cross-examination was sharp and aggressive. "Dr. Kim, are you aware that Mr. Chen Williams was observed in known drug trafficking areas just last week?" "I'm aware of allegations to that effect," Dr. Kim replied calmly.
What I'm also aware of is that David regularly volunteers at needle exchange programs and homeless outreach services in those same areas. His presence there reflects his commitment to helping others, not engaging in illegal activity. Walsh produced photographs that Torres had clearly taken with telephoto lenses. These images show your client in conversation with known drug dealers. They show him in conversation with people experiencing homelessness and addiction, the population he serves through his volunteer work, Dr. Kim corrected firmly. If we criminalize contact with struggling populations, we criminalize the very service work that demonstrates David's character growth. Sandy watched the judge's expression as Dr. Kim dismantled Walsh's implications with professional expertise and moral clarity. Judge Morrison had clearly seen enough manipulation tactics to recognize character assassination when she saw it. Detective Santos testified next, his 20 years of street experience lending credibility to his assessment of David's character and community role. Your Honor, I've known David Chen Williams for 5 years, both during his addiction period and throughout his recovery. His transformation has been remarkable, but more importantly, it's been genuine. Walsh's attempt to discredit Santos as biased failed when he calmly outlined the attempted drug planting at David's residence. Someone with resources and connections tried to frame Mr. Chen Williams just days after this will contest was filed. That suggests desperation from people who know their legal arguments won't stand on merit. The courtroom stirred as the implications sank in. Victoria's face remained impassive, but Sandy caught James watching his sister with something approaching disgust. When Eleanor called James to testify, his words carried the weight of someone who understood addiction and family dysfunction from personal experience. Your Honor, I've struggled with alcohol dependency for years, while enjoying every privilege money can provide. David has overcome heroin addiction while surviving homelessness and abandonment. If addiction disqualifies someone from inheritance, I should lose mine too. But if recovery and character growth matter, then David has earned his place in this family more than anyone. Eleanor's final witness was David himself. His testimony was simple, honest, and devastating in its authenticity. I followed my grandfather for 3 days because I was terrified, he said, his voice steady despite the courtroom full of strangers judging his every word. I knew my addiction had destroyed my father, and I was afraid the same pattern would make me unwelcome. But William Chen saw past my worst moments to my potential for something better. He invested in my recovery not because I was perfect, but because he believed people deserved second chances. David looked directly at Victoria as he continued. I understand why my family sees me as a threat. I represent everything they've been taught to fear: poverty, addiction, the possibility that wealth doesn't automatically make someone worthy of respect. But I also represent something else: the idea that people can change, that love doesn't have to be conditional, and that family means more than shared DNA or social status. Catherine Walsh's cross-examination was brutal, forcing David to relive his worst moments, his failures, his crimes committed during active addiction. But he answered every question with honesty and humility, never making excuses, but acknowledging the harm he'd caused and the work he'd done to make amends. Mr. Chen Williams, how can this court trust someone with your history to responsibly manage $35 million?
David was quiet for a moment, considering the question that would determine his future. Because I understand what it means to have nothing, Your Honor. I know the difference between money and worth, between privilege and character. William Chen structured the inheritance to protect me from my own vulnerabilities, while allowing me to help others facing the same struggles I survived. That's not about trust. It's about using wealth the way he intended, as a tool for redemption rather than a measure of superiority. Judge Morrison called a brief recess, leaving both legal teams to await a decision that would determine not just David's inheritance, but the fundamental question of whether people could truly change, whether family love could transcend prejudice, and whether society's most vulnerable deserve the same chances for redemption as those born with every advantage.
6 months after Judge Morrison upheld William Chen's will in its entirety, Sandy stood in the renovated community center in the Tenderloin, watching David teach art therapy to recovering addicts. The Marcus Chen Williams Recovery Center occupied a full city block, its bright murals and welcoming design a stark contrast to the institutional buildings that typically served this population. "The Foundation's impact report is ready," Eleanor said, approaching with a folder thick with documentation. At 59, retirement had suited her well. She'd found purpose in administrating charitable work rather than managing wealthy families' dysfunction. Sandy reviewed the numbers with satisfaction. 50 people housed in transitional apartments, 37 enrolled in job training programs, 15 completing college courses, and David painting alongside clients who understood both his journey and his commitment to never forgetting where he'd come from. James emerged from the administrative offices, his 6 months of sobriety evident in his clear eyes and steady hands. "The city council approved our expansion proposal. We can break ground on the second building next spring." "And Victoria?" Sandy asked, though she already knew the answer. "Still fighting the court's decision, but her new legal fees are bankrupting her. Turns out spending millions to destroy someone's character doesn't generate positive returns." James's smile held no malice, only sadness for opportunities his sister had chosen to waste. Victoria had lost more than money in the legal battle. Her reputation as an attorney had suffered when details of the planted drugs emerged. Several clients had terminated their contracts, unable to trust someone who would stoop to framing a recovering addict to protect her inheritance. David approached, paint-stained hands carrying the same creative stains Sandy had noticed during their first meeting. "Sandy, there's someone I want you to meet." He led her to a quiet woman in her early 50s, thin and fragile, but with eyes that held cautious hope. "This is Anna Williams, my mother." Sandy's breath caught. Anna had emerged from the care facility where she'd spent years recovering from her breakdown, drawn by news of her son's transformation and the possibility of rebuilding a relationship 20 years in the making. "Sandy," Anna said quietly, "David told me how you chose family over money, love over judgment. I wanted to thank you for giving my son what I couldn't, the belief that he was worth saving." Looking around the recovery center that bore her uncle's name, Sandy realized William Chen's true legacy wasn't the money he'd left behind. It was the proof that families could be rebuilt on foundations of choice rather than circumstance, that redemption was possible when people had genuine support, and that sometimes the greatest inheritance was simply the courage to believe that everyone deserved a second chance. The hidden heir had been found not in David's bloodline or bank account, but in the understanding that real family was built through love, loyalty, and the willingness to see potential in people that society had written off. In the end, that inheritance was worth far more than $50 million. It was priceless. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.